You open the oven door to check on dinner, and the smell hits you before the heat does. Burnt grease, old drippings that have been baking themselves into the bottom for weeks, maybe months. You close the door a little faster than you opened it. The food goes in, the timer gets set, and the oven stays dirty. Again. If that sounds familiar, you are not alone in it. The oven has quietly become the most avoided appliance in the modern home. People clean their counters, scrub their sinks, mop their floors, and still leave the oven for later. Later becomes next week. Next week becomes the holidays. The holidays bring a full pan of drippings that smoke the whole kitchen. And suddenly, you are standing in front of a shelf of chemical sprays that promise to dissolve what has spent 6 months turning to carbon on your oven floor. This is not a failure of willpower, it is a failure of rhythm. And women in the 1950s understood something about rhythm that most of us have quietly lost. If you find yourself drawn to the kind of practical, forgotten home knowledge that actually works, consider subscribing. There is more of it here than you might expect, and it costs nothing to stay. Now, before the panic cleaning and the fume-filled sprays, there was a different way of thinking about the oven entirely. Women in the post-war American home, the late 1940s through the 1950s, did not have the cleaning products we now consider basic. The aerosol oven cleaners that fill supermarket shelves today did not become widely available until the early 1960s. Before that, if your oven was dirty, you cleaned it yourself with what you had. Baking soda, white vinegar, salt, dish soap, hot water, a rag that had seen better days. And the remarkable thing is that it worked. Not because those women had some secret formula nobody else knew, but because they approached the oven the same way they approached every other surface in the house, as something that needed regular attention, not occasional rescue. The distinction matters more than it sounds. When you treat cleaning as rescue, you wait until the problem is visible, smelly, or embarrassing. You let grease build up over weeks until it has baked itself into a hard, dark layer that resists everything short of a chemical designed for exactly that job. Then you buy the spray, endure the fumes, scrub for an hour, and feel relieved until the next time. And the next time always comes, because the habit never changed, only the product did. When you treat cleaning as rhythm, the problem never gets that far. You wipe while things are still warm. You catch the spill before it bakes on. You give the oven a proper clean once a month, not once a year. The work is smaller each time because the buildup is smaller each time. The oven never becomes a crisis. That is what 1950s women were actually doing, not performing domestic perfection for some imagined audience, not following a magazine ideal. They were managing a working kitchen the way a working kitchen has to be managed, consistently, practically, and without a supply closet full of specialized products. Think about what a kitchen looked like in that era. Smaller usually, one oven used daily. Meals cooked from scratch most nights of the week. Roasts, casseroles, pies, biscuits, food that drips and bubbles and splatters. With that kind of daily use, there was no option to ignore the oven. It had to stay functional because it was used every single day. Neglecting it was not really an option in the way it has become for us. We have made oven neglect easier in some ways. Takeout and delivery mean fewer meals cooked at home. Frozen meals mean shorter oven times and less dripping. The oven gets used less, so the excuse to skip cleaning it always seems reasonable. But the grease that does accumulate still bakes harder with every use. And when a real clean finally becomes necessary, the job is always worse than it needed to be. The 1950s answer to this problem was not a better product. It was a better habit. And habits, unlike products, do not run out. Before the full method, though, it is worth understanding why the 1950s oven did not get as filthy in the first place. The cleaning technique is only half the story. The other half is what happened in the hours and days between cleanings. The small, almost invisible habits that kept the oven from ever reaching the state that sends modern households hunting for the heaviest chemical spray on the shelf. That is where the real secret was hiding all along, and it begins the moment the oven door opens after cooking. The clean oven did not start with a scrub brush. It started with a woman who knew that the minute dinner came out, the oven still had work left to do. Her work, not its own. In the 1950s home, the oven was treated as a surface that needed tending after every use. The same way a cast iron skillet was wiped down before being put away. or a stovetop was given a quick pass before the kitchen closed for the night. Not a deep clean, not a production, just a small, consistent act of attention that meant the grease never had the chance to become a problem. The first habit was the simplest one, and it is also the one most people skip entirely today: wiping the oven while it was still warm, not scorching hot. You were not reaching into a blazing oven, but warm. The kind of warm that lingers 20 minutes after the last dish comes out. At that temperature, fresh grease is still soft. It has not yet bonded to the oven surface. A damp cloth, sometimes with a drop of dish soap, could lift it in a single pass. The same grease left until the oven cools completely and then reheated the next day. And the day after that becomes something else entirely. It polymerizes, it hardens, it darkens. It stops being grease and starts being a layer that requires real effort to remove. That warm wipe habit alone changed what kind of cleaning job the oven ever needed. If you wiped it warm after every use, or even most uses, the monthly deep clean was never starting from a bad place. It was just maintenance, not restoration. The second habit was about containing the mess before it happened. Women in that era used what they had to protect the oven floor. A sheet of aluminum foil laid flat on the bottom rack, changed out regularly, caught the drips from roasting pans and pie dishes before they ever touched the oven surface. Some women placed a shallow baking pan on the lowest rack as a permanent drip catcher. Others lined the bottom of casserole dishes more carefully, knowing that an overfull dish meant a spill, and a spill meant work. This sounds obvious, but it reflects a mindset that is genuinely different from how many people cook today. The 1950s cook was thinking about the cleanup while the food was still being prepared. Not obsessively, it was just part of the rhythm. Fill the dish to here, not to there. Put the foil down before the roast goes in. Slide a pan underneath the pie. These were not extra steps so much as built-in ones, habits folded so naturally into the cooking process that they did not feel like extra effort at all. The result was an oven floor that rarely had much on it because most of what might have landed there had been caught somewhere else first. Then there was the salt trick, which is one of those old habits so simple it almost sounds made up until you try it. If something spilled or bubbled over while the oven was still hot, a fruit pie sending juice over the rim, a casserole that got too enthusiastic, the response was not to wait and deal with it later. A handful of table salt was poured directly onto the spill, right then, while the oven was still at temperature. Salt absorbs moisture and draws the liquid up before it has a chance to bake onto the surface. It also forms a crust around the spill that, once the oven cools, can be swept out cleanly with a dry cloth or a soft brush. The spill that would have required 20 minutes of scrubbing if left to harden became a 5-second sweep out instead. Salt was cheap. It was always in the kitchen, and it worked before the mess had time to become permanent. Do you remember your mother or grandmother wiping down the oven after cooking or doing something like this with a spill? It is the kind of small detail that gets lost between generations because nobody thinks to teach it formally. It was just what you did. The third layer of prevention was about oven use itself. Women in the 1950s tended to be precise about what they put in the oven and how. Dishes were properly covered when covering was needed. Roasting pans were sized to the cut of meat so dripping stayed contained. Pies were placed on a rack with enough room for air to move around them, not crammed in at an angle. None of this was fussiness. It was practical economy. A woman managing a household budget and a full cooking schedule had no interest in creating extra cleaning work through careless oven habits. The oven was a tool, and tools were respected. You used them correctly, you cared for them after, and they kept working without drama. The modern contrast is not hard to see. We slide things into the oven without thinking much about containment. Cook at higher temperatures with more convenience foods that bubble and splatter unpredictably, and then leave the result for another day. The oven is used less thoughtfully precisely because cleaning products exist to fix the aftermath, or so the logic goes. The chemical spray becomes the excuse not to prevent the mess in the first place. What those prevention habits built, cumulatively, was an oven that was never more than a moderate cleaning job away from clean. The warm wipe, the drip catcher, the salt on fresh spills, and the careful loading. None of these small habits took very long at all. None of these took more than a few minutes across the course of a week. But together, they meant that when a real clean was needed, the work was manageable. There was grease, certainly. There was residue. But there was not the kind of carbonized, months-deep buildup that sends modern households straight to the strongest chemical option available. And that is exactly where the actual cleaning method comes in, because even a well-tended oven needed a thorough clean from time to time. And the women of the 1950s had a way of doing it that required nothing more than what was already sitting in the pantry, starting with a paste that worked overnight while they slept. The pantry in a 1950s kitchen was not stocked with specialized cleaners for every surface. There was no separate product for the oven, another for the stovetop, another for the tile grout. There was baking soda, white vinegar, salt, dish soap, and hot water. That was the cleaning arsenal, and it handled everything from the bathroom sink to the kitchen floor. The oven was no different. What made these ingredients effective was not magic chemistry. Baking soda is a mild abrasive and a natural deodorizer. White vinegar is acidic enough to cut through grease and dissolve mineral deposits. Together, they create a reaction that loosens grime from surfaces without scratching them. Dish soap adds a grease-cutting surfactant that helps lift residue away from the oven walls. None of this is complicated. All of it was understood by practical women long before the science had a name for it. The method that emerges from these ingredients is straightforward, patient, and genuinely effective, even on ovens that have been neglected longer than they should have been. The first step was always preparation. Everything came out of the oven before anything went in. Racks were pulled out and set aside. The oven thermometer, if there was one, came out. The oven floor was swept with a dry cloth or a soft brush to remove any loose crumbs, ash, or hardened salt from a previous spill treatment. To remove any loose crumbs, ash, or hardened salt from a previous spill treatment. You cannot paste over dry debris and expect a good result. The surface had to be clear before the real work started. The baking soda paste was made in a small bowl. Roughly half a cup of baking soda mixed with just enough water to form a thick, spreadable paste. The consistency of toothpaste, not soup. Some women added a few drops of dish soap to the paste for extra grease-cutting power. Some added a small amount of white vinegar directly into the paste, which caused it to fizz immediately and then settle into a slightly looser mixture that was still workable. The fizzing was not the cleaning, it was just the chemical reaction between the acid and the base. The cleaning happened slowly, over time, as the paste sat against the grease and broke it down. The paste went onto every interior surface of the oven. The walls, the floor, the interior of the door, everywhere except the heating elements. It was spread with the hands, wearing rubber gloves or with a pastry brush, or simply with a damp cloth used as an applicator. It did not need to be thick everywhere, but it needed to make contact with the grease. Anywhere grease had built up, the paste went on a little heavier. Then came the part that separated the 1950s approach from the modern one most clearly. Then they simply waited for the cleaning paste to work its magic. The paste was applied in the evening, before bed. The oven door was left slightly ajar if the kitchen was ventilated, or simply closed and left alone. The paste sat overnight, 8 to 12 hours. While the household slept, the baking soda was working against the grease, softening it, loosening its grip on the oven surface, pulling the grime away from the metal without any scrubbing required. Patience was doing the work that chemical force does in the modern version. The result in the morning was a paste that had yellowed and darkened in places, particularly where the grease buildup had been heaviest. That discoloration was the grease coming up into the paste, rather than staying bonded to the oven wall. In the morning, a damp cloth was used to wipe the paste away in sections. It came off in long, greasy strokes, taking the loosened grime with it. A soft brush, an old toothbrush was common, handled the corners, the edges around the door seal, and any spot where the paste had dried into a stubborn crust. A spray bottle filled with white vinegar was then used on the remaining baking soda residue. The vinegar caused the leftover paste to fizz lightly, which helped lift the last traces away from the surface. A final wipe with a clean, damp cloth left the interior looking markedly different from the night before. Have you ever tried this method, baking soda paste left overnight and wiped away in the morning? It has a way of working better than it looks like it should, which is probably why it survived as long as it did. The oven racks were handled separately, and the method was just as simple. The racks were placed in the bathtub, lined with old towels to prevent scratching the tub surface, and submerged in the hottest water the tap would produce, mixed with a generous pour of dish soap. They soaked for several hours, sometimes overnight alongside the oven paste treatment. Soaking did most of the work. Grease that had baked onto the rack wire softened in the hot, soapy water until it could be wiped away with a cloth or scrubbed off with a stiff brush without significant effort. The racks came out clean, rinsed under the tap, dried thoroughly before going back into the oven. No specialty rack cleaner, no separate spray, hot water, dish soap, and time. The oven door glass was given its own treatment. A common 1950s method involved dipping a damp cloth in dry baking soda and rubbing it in small circles across the glass interior. The baking soda acted as a gentle abrasive that lifted the cloudy, greasy film from the glass without scratching it. Some women used a crumpled sheet of newspaper dampened with white vinegar for the final buff. The same technique used on windows, which left glass streak-free and clear. The door glass that had looked permanently clouded often came back to near transparency with 15 minutes of this treatment. One historical method worth mentioning, because it genuinely was used, is the ammonia technique. A small bowl of household ammonia, not bleach, not a mixture of anything, plain ammonia, was placed inside a cold oven overnight with the door closed. The ammonia fumes worked on the grease through the night, softening it so that the next morning everything wiped away with minimal effort. It was effective. It was also something that required a specific set of conditions to be done safely. The kitchen needed to be well ventilated. The oven had to be completely cold before the bowl went in and stayed cold throughout. And ammonia was never, under any circumstances, mixed with bleach or any bleach-containing product. That combination produces toxic chloramine gas, and no clean oven is worth that risk. If this method interests you as a historical curiosity or a practical option, treat the ventilation requirement as non-negotiable and never combine ammonia with any other cleaning product. What all of these methods share is the same underlying logic. They substituted time and patience for chemical intensity. The paste sat overnight so that scrubbing was minimal. The racks soaked for hours so the grease released on its own. The ammonia fumes worked slowly through the night so that nothing needed to be forced off the surface in the morning. These women were not working harder than necessary. They were working intelligently, using what they had, and letting chemistry and time do the heavy lifting while they slept. The oven that emerged from this process was clean in a way that felt earned rather than forced. But getting it clean was only part of the discipline. What happened after the cleaning, how the oven was dried, maintained, and worked back into a regular rhythm, was what determined whether it stayed that way. The cleaning was not finished when the paste came off. That is a detail that sounds small, but carries real weight in understanding how 1950s women thought about their appliances. After every surface had been wiped down, after the racks had gone back in and the door glass had been buffed clear, there was one final step that almost nobody bothers with today. The oven was dried. A clean, dry cloth went over every interior surface, the walls, the floor, the door, to pull away any remaining moisture left behind by the damp cleaning cloths. The oven was then turned on at a low temperature for 10 to 15 minutes to drive out the last of the dampness from the corners and the rack grooves. This was not fussiness. Older oven surfaces, particularly in the cast iron and bare steel interiors, common before porcelain enamel coatings became standard, could develop rust spots if moisture was left sitting against them. Rust on an oven interior was not just unsightly, it was a surface that would hold grease more aggressively. The next time the oven was used, making future cleaning harder, the dry-out step closed the cleaning process properly and protected the work that had just been done. A light wipe of vegetable shortening or lard on bare metal interior surfaces, applied with a cloth, and then heated off, was sometimes used the same way a cast iron pan was seasoned, creating a thin protective layer that resisted rust and made future grease less likely to bond permanently to the metal. Not every household did this, but in kitchens where the oven interior was uncoated steel, It was a practical finishing touch that extended the time between necessary deep cleans. The rhythm that followed the deep clean was what made the difference between a kitchen that stayed manageable and one that cycled endlessly between neglect and crisis. A 1950s housewife was not deep cleaning her oven every week. That would have been unnecessary and exhausting. But she was not leaving it for 6 months either. The cadence looked something like this. A warm wipe after most cooking sessions, a more thorough wipe down with a damp soapy cloth once a week as part of the regular kitchen reset, and a full baking soda paste clean once a month. Or whenever the oven showed signs of buildup that the weekly wipe was no longer handling comfortably. That monthly clean, done on a surface that had been wiped regularly throughout the weeks before, was never a large job. The paste went on, sat overnight, came off in the morning, and the oven was back in use by midday. An hour of actual work, spread across an evening and a morning, kept the oven in a state that never required emergency intervention. An hour of actual work, spread across an evening and a morning, kept the oven in a state that never required emergency intervention. The weekly wipe took perhaps 5 minutes. The warm post-cooking wipe took less than 2. The monthly paste clean, including the rack soak, was an afternoon's light work. Added together across a month, the time investment was modest. What it bought was an oven that was always ready, always clean enough to cook in without embarrassment, and never the source of smoke alarms and fume-filled evenings. When did oven cleaning become something we dread rather than something we simply do? That question does not have a single clean answer, but part of it almost certainly has to do with the arrival of products that promised to make the job effortless. When a spray can told you it would dissolve months of grease in 30 minutes, the implicit message was that you could let those months accumulate without consequence. The product would handle it. The habit of regular maintenance started to feel unnecessary, even old-fashioned, when a chemical solution was sitting under the sink. The self-cleaning oven made things more extreme still. Introduced in the early 1960s and refined through the following decades, the self-cleaning cycle locked the oven at temperatures high enough to incinerate grease into ash, which could then be wiped away with a dry cloth. For many, the promise of a self-cleaning oven was a dream come true, offering genuine convenience and saving hours of manual labor. It also produced enough heat and smell and smoke to make many people avoid running the cycle at all, which meant the self-cleaning oven often cleaned itself less frequently than the old manual method had been applied. The convenience feature created its own form of avoidance. We now have ovens with digital controls, convection settings, steam cleaning modes, and interior coatings designed to resist grease bonding. And yet oven cleaning remains one of the most procrastinated household tasks in the modern home. The technology improved. The habit did not come with it. There is a deeper lesson sitting inside all of this, and it is one that runs through almost every forgotten 1950s home system when you look at them closely enough. The clean home of that era was not the product of better tools or stronger chemicals or more storage space. It was the product of small, consistent habits applied before problems had the chance to grow large. The warm wipe, the drip catcher, the salt on the fresh spill, the monthly paste. None of these required anything that is not sitting in a kitchen right now. They required only the decision to do a small thing regularly instead of a large thing occasionally. The women who ran those kitchens were not performing an ideal. They were solving a practical problem with practical means, and the solution happened to be gentle on surfaces, gentle on the air in the home, and gentle on the budget. No fumes, no rubber gloves thick enough to handle industrial chemicals. No ovens sitting unusable for hours while a caustic spray did its work. Just baking soda, vinegar, salt, dish soap, hot water, and the understanding that tending to something regularly is always easier than rescuing it from neglect. That knowledge did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because products arrived that made neglect feel consequence-free, right up until the moment it was not. The image worth leaving with is a simple one. A woman in a cotton house dress, pulling a golden pie from an oven that smells of pastry and nothing else. No smoke, no acrid grease burn. The oven is clean because she never let it get away from her. She wiped it warm after the roast on Sunday. She caught the cherry filling that bubbled over with a handful of salt. She gave it a proper paste clean last month and will do the same again next month. The oven is clean because she made it part of her rhythm, not her crisis list. That rhythm is not lost. It is just waiting to be picked back up, one warm wipe at a time. If you want more of this forgotten home wisdom, subscribe so you won't miss it. There is much more here, no special products required,